For coming to the forum, the title of which is Turmoil in the Middle East, People's Turn, ? And we thought, given the recent events in the Middle East, many observers consider them to be a watershed event in the history of the region, and a set of events that might have wide-ranging global implications. So we thought it might be a good idea to bring together a group of experts that will explore some of the local, regional, and global implications of the events that have engulfed the region over the last 2 months. Let me start by introducing the panelists, going from my right, from your left. Professor David Biale is Emmanuel Ringelblum Professor of Jewish History and Chair of the History Department at UC Davis. He has published widely on Jewish matters and Jewish thought, and his recent publications include the book Blood and Belief, The Circulation of a Symbol Between Jews and Christians, that was published by the University of California Press in 2007. Next, Professor Keith David Watenpaugh. He's an historian and an associate professor of modern Islam, human rights, and peace. And his recent book is Being Modern in the Middle East: Revolution, Nationalism, and the Arab Middle Class. Very timely subject. To my left, Professor Scott Gartner is a professor of political science and director of the International Relations Program here at UC Davis. And he's the author of Strategic Assessment in War that was published by Yale University Press in 1997 and has written many articles on conflict and public opinion. And last but not least, Professor Miroslav Nincic, also professor of political science, and is the author of a recent book, Renegade Regimes, excuse me, Confronting Deviant Behavior in World Politics, published by Columbia University Press in 2005. And I'm Zeev Maoz. I'm also a professor of political science and have done research on security and foreign policy in the Middle East. And my last, or next to last book is Defending the Holy Land, critical analysis of Israel's security and foreign policy. The format is as follows. Each of us will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions. We have 2 microphones on both sides of the hallway, and we ask those of you who want to ask questions to step to the microphone, ask the question, and we will respond. So without further ado, let me start with Professor Watenpaugh, who will talk about human rights in the Middle East.
Good evening, and I want to thank you for coming tonight. I see lots of members of the community as well as my students here, and I very much appreciate your interest in a part of the world where I've lived for many years and what is very important to me. I thought what I would begin with, though, is some good news. I know we've been hearing sort of distressing news out of Egypt. I received an email forwarded to me from the Egypt Supreme Council of Antiquities, which takes care of the museum and the pyramids and all the regional archaeological digs and so on, noting that even though there was looting at the Egyptian National Museum, it was primarily of the gift shop, not of the museum per se, and that the antiquities that were stolen were all reproductions. And but in very encouraging news, the director of Antiquities notes that at places like Luxor and Aswan and other places up and down the Nile Valley where there are important archaeological sites, that local villagers have taken ownership of these sites and formed human chains to protect them from looting. He also notes that the looters didn't take any books, so apparently that's not what looters like to take. So I've been tasked tonight with talking about human rights and what I'm calling the Tahrir Square Revolution. Tahrir Square, of course, being Medina Tahrir, or Liberation Square, this magnificent circle, that's not really a square, at the center of the modern part of the city of Cairo, On one side is the Great Egyptian Museum. The other side is the Mogama, the Central Bureaucratic Office for Egypt. And on the other side is the American University. And another side is now Hilton. It's just an important part of Egyptian society. And the protesters who have made camp there are making a very important statement on behalf of their people. But I want to talk about human rights also as someone who works on human rights issues throughout the Arab world, as well as a person helping direct and develop our undergraduate human rights teaching at UC Davis. And the idea that I want to leave you with tonight is that the Tahrir Square Revolution is evidence of what I call the vernacularization of a language of human rights in Arab society. And what do I mean by vernacularization? What I mean is that there's a general understanding of what human rights are, why they matter, and that they should play a fundamental role in society. And that realization has achieved a broad awareness amongst Arabs, still primarily the middle class, but also those within the less middle class elements of society. A broad awareness has been achieved nonetheless. And this is a powerful language, a new language which is taking shape and taking hold in the Arab Middle East, which has been denied by states, has been denied by the governments that have ruled most of the countries since the end, really, of the Second World War. And it's a powerful language which is resonating, but it is still a very weak and fragile force in the face of the very brutal and authoritarian regimes which rule the majority of the Arab world. And one of the key concepts we often explore in our human rights courses is that the awareness of rights is a precursor to claiming rights. And understanding how this awareness of rights is fostered in parts of the world where powerful forces are arrayed against it, human rights, is a critical question to try to answer, especially as American policy towards the Arab world is reformulated using this opportunity. So what I thought I'd do in the remainder of time is understand what human rights abuses are in Egypt, sort of the natural history of human rights abuses in Egypt, see what kinds of measures that people have taken to try to confront human rights abuses, and what I see is happening going forward, and then expand the discussion to think about the issues raised and the movement itself as it expands beyond Egypt, possibly to other parts of the Arab world, and things which are happening in places like Jordan, or not happening in Syria, in Iraq, in Palestine, Algeria, and Tunisia. First, a natural history of human rights abuse in Egypt. We can go back fairly far in the history of Egypt to the beginnings of when human rights abuses became fairly prominent, but what I want to do is move back primarily to 1981. Following the assassination of the second president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, who became president of Egypt after the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser, his assassination at the hands of Islamist radicals was the triggering to the creation of sort of an emergency law, or the suspension of the constitution in Egypt. And from that period on, human rights abuses became fairly common in Egypt. Beforehand, they had been sort of reserved primarily for regime opponents, mostly members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and some members of the Egyptian left. But after 1981, these human rights abuses accelerated and expanded to more and more parts of Egyptian society. And it especially became, and what did the suspension of the constitution mean for, or the declaration of emergency law mean for Egypt? It primarily meant that the government could short-circuit cases of law cases, could short-circuit criminal cases, and hold people under what was called administrative detention for weeks, months, years at a time. Essentially, the government had a right to disappear people into its prison system. Another practice that was fairly common was that people would be taken to one prison and then moved quietly from one prison to another, where they wouldn't, their families and other people wouldn't be able to find them, their lawyers wouldn't be able to find them, and so on. In the course of the 1980s and 1990s, the bulk of human rights abuses were visited upon members of Egypt's more sort of Islamist opposition. These were not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but very violent offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, including the Islamic Jihad. These sorts of the human rights abuses, which were typical of the time, were again disappearance, detention without trial, but also torture. And as I explained to my students, torture is a fairly routine aspect of imprisonment in Egypt, and it often is physical torture, beatings, electrocutions, but also sexual assault. So as Egypt sort of won its war against the Islamists in the course of the 1990s, I mean, perhaps some of you recall the very vicious bombing of the Temple of Hatshepsut in Upper Egypt, an attempt by the Islamist radicals to disrupt Egypt's tourist trade. The Egyptian government was very effective in suppressing that, but used extremely violent means to do so. With the end of that period, sort of the successful suppression of Islamist radicalism in Egypt, it was thought that Egypt would then begin to open up. And we're talking about the end of the 1990s and 2000. And that supposed opening up did begin to open some room for human rights activists and NGOs to form, opposition parties to begin to take shape. But instead of opening up, what we saw instead was that the regime itself began to circle its wagons and then begin to view these sort of beginnings of civil society in Egypt as a real threat to the persistence of the regime. Often using the potential boogeyman of the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood to justify abuses, it began to shift the sort of pressure, human rights abuse pressure, onto different segments of Egyptian society that hadn't faced this kind of pressure before. And this included primarily people in legal professions, lawyers. This also included women's activists. This also included people in new labor movements, the Egyptian left having been severely decimated or sort of reduced in the course of the 1950s and 1960s. So I really see this as the beginning of 2000 as a very interesting moment in contemporary Egyptian history in terms of its relationship to human rights and the relationship of the Egyptian government to that question, because we see a new group of Egyptians, young Egyptians who had facility with internet communication, beginning to integrate human rights claims into their claims against the Egyptian government. So much so that we saw the formation of, we saw the arrest of some of these most prominently in the early 2000s of Saad-Eddin Ibrahim, but also other kinds of rights activists and so on later on. And I want to fast forward, though, to sort of the question of human rights and the most immediate situation during the Tahrir Square Revolution. Human rights abuse, a very egregious human rights abuse, is at the center of some of the reasons why many of these young people have taken to the streets. And those who've been following this know just yesterday, Wael Ghanem, Google's representative in North Africa, was released after several days of detention by the Egyptian security forces. And what he had done, he's a young guy, he's in his 30s, what he had done is he created a Facebook page called Kuluna Khaled Saeed. We are all Khaled Saeed, a Facebook page on behalf of a young Egyptian man who had drawn attention to a very egregious abuse of power by the Egyptian police. He had been able to locate a photograph of Egyptian police stealing a drug cache after a drug bust. Khaled was then, he posted this on his web page. He was then arrested and died in custody. The Egyptian police said he died of an apparent drug overdose, but pictures then surfaced of his badly beaten body. So he had been murdered by the Egyptian security forces while in detention. And the movement, We Are All Khaled Saeed, was one of the movements that helped galvanize some of the young people in Egypt to come out. But again, this is the claims that these young people are making are being made in the language of human rights. And we're seeing again, human rights activists are now being rounded up in Egypt. The most important is a blogger, Karim Amer, who has now gone missing, who is presumably being held by the police. And he was the first blogger to be jailed by the Egyptian security forces 4 years ago for allegedly insulting Islam and the president. Now, what I want to turn to, okay, 2 more minutes. I just want to turn to the question of human rights looking forward in the Egyptian revolution. And hopefully during questions we can talk about the way this looks in other parts of the Arab world. And I think that I would imagine that many of the people demonstrating now would like to integrate respect for human rights into the Egypt of the future. But I see this as a very difficult challenge, especially because the individual that the United States and Egypt and others around the world are really looking to usher this transition from this old authoritarian style to perhaps something better is Omar Suleiman, who was appointed the Egyptian vice president. I only facetiously refer to Omar Suleiman as Egypt's torturer-in-chief, as he's a military man, a general, and he headed the Interior Ministry in Egypt. And unlike the United States, where the Interior Ministry takes care of the national park system and so on, in Egypt, the Interior Ministry is perhaps the most feared institution because it is the institution that runs the security police. Omar Suleiman, among his many sort of past deeds, was help cooperate with the United States Extreme Rendition Program, in which the previous administrations of the previous U.S. administrations would take suspected Islamist radicals in their custody and return them to Egypt, where they would be tortured and be denied due process. So it's very difficult for me to see someone like Omar Suleiman, who has been responsible for creating the culture of impunity in Egypt over the last 30 years, as being someone who's really capable or interested in ushering in a regime of human rights. And finally, I would just argue that a culture of impunity, which exists in Egypt around the violation of human rights, the denial of torture, the denial of due process, and so on, is very difficult to dismantle. And even when there's a great deal of will to do so, as there is in Iraq, that has proved a very, very difficult process. And it's something that can't be done overnight. It really takes a generation to try to achieve. Thank you.
People who are standing are invited. There's plenty of room down a few steps down, so please.
That's a mobile. These are only covered.
Oh, what's it here?
There's a switch on top.
Okay, well, thank you. Is this working now? Yes. Okay, great. So I've been asked to speak about the reaction of Israel to, or the implications for Israel of the recent events in Egypt. To some degree, it's captured by a headline, a sort of tongue-in-cheek headline of an op-ed that appeared in one of the Israeli newspapers. "We aren't the center of the world anymore," which suggests the sort of view that Israelis tend to have, sort of navel-gazing, their conflict with the Arab world, especially the Palestinians, is sort of the center of things. What happens if all of a sudden the center appears elsewhere? And it's deeply, I think, disorienting for them in a variety of ways that I think are actually very interesting, and as I'll try to suggest, maybe even promising for some progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, the instinctive reaction of the political elite in Israel was to see this as, see the revolution in Egypt as destabilizing and threatening to them. The government sent out word to its ambassadors to tell governments around the world to support Mubarak, not to criticize him too much. And that, of course, immediately got out, which undermined that campaign. The basic message that they gave was, to quote the sort of well-known dictum, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And Mubarak is obviously, you know, a brutal dictator, but he's on our side, and therefore we don't want to undermine him. Now, this strategic relationship with Egypt, the fact that Israeli policy is based so much on a particular type of Egyptian regime, one that preserves the peace treaty of 1979, one that suppresses the Muslim Brotherhood. This has now all been shaken. We have to understand the origins of this strategic policy. Israel and Egypt fought 4 very bloody wars between 1948 and 1973. Both sides were badly damaged by these wars. They did not want to continue, and that was really the reason why they made a peace treaty in 1979. When Anwar Sadat was assassinated, and he was the one who made that treaty with Israel, he was succeeded by Mubarak, and Mubarak made it clear that he was going to preserve this treaty because he understood partly that American aid was dependent on it, but also partly because as a man who came out of the Egyptian army, he was the chief of the Air Force during the 73 war, he understood the risks to Egypt of destabilizing this peace treaty. But the irony for Israel is that it is a democracy, an imperfect democracy to be sure, but it's still a democracy, that the prospect of a democracy in Egypt is disorienting for them. First of all, Israeli foreign sort of public relations and foreign policy is based on the idea that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, of course, one could argue that Iraq is on the road towards such a democracy, but as we all know, it's got a long way to go. So Israel bases a great deal on this. What happens if they're not the only democracy in the Middle East? And moreover, and this is the reason they're really anxious, is that the interpretation that's generally given of democratization in the Middle East is that if there are democratic elections, then right-wing Islamist regimes will come to power. And for their evidence, they quote what happened when the Palestinians had elections in 2007 and Hamas won the elections. So the argument there is that Egyptian democracy will certainly lead the same way, that is, the Muslim Brotherhood will take over. And I think it's very hard for them to wrap their minds around the possibility that something else is happening in Egypt, as I think we see from all the reporting that's coming back. Brotherhood is, to be sure, there, but it is not. It's not the same as Hamas, even though it gave birth to Hamas. The Hamas comes out of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but they're quite a different species. At least that's not my expertise, but this is how I understand it. And moreover, they are not the necessarily leading force of the Egyptian revolution. So, yes, a kind of alternative view to this. This sort of anxiety that one hears from the political elite in Israel. By the way, one hears it also from American Jewish leadership. The executive director of the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, or the chief lobbying group for the American Jewish community, told the press that Mohammed al-Baradei is an Iranian stooge. And clearly the point of this was to say, you know, the opposition cannot be trusted. We have to side with Mubarak. But I think that there is an alternative point of view. And it was summed up actually by a very fine column by Bradley Burston, who writes a weekly column in the English language website of Haaretz, one of Israel's main newspapers, in which he said that what was so exciting about seeing these people in Tahrir Square, seeing this revolution, is that we've been raised with the idea that the Middle East is frozen in time, that nothing can ever change there. That even if there is a change, like a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, that actually nothing really changes, especially with regard to the Palestinians. In fact, the 1979 treaty between Egypt and Israel contained a kind of a clause that said that Israel was going to give local autonomy to the Palestinians in the occupied territories. They never did that, but that was the way in which, Sadat, it was a kind of fig leaf for Sadat in making the treaty. It was a fig leaf for the Israelis, and they were able to sort of sweep the Palestinian issue under the carpet. This time I think that something else may happen. If there is indeed a democratic revolution in Egypt, it's clear from public opinion in Egypt that they want a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They want Israel to get out of the territories. And I think that will actually exert pressure on both Israel and the Palestinians to come to an agreement. I think it actually could be a very positive thing. So I leave you with that note of optimism.
Actually, you can hear me all right? Yes? No? Can you hear me all right? I was told I had to wear a tie. If you could wear a tie, this would be a problem. This is what the tie is. I'll hold it in my hand. That's fine. I've been asked to address the question of the implications of the Middle East turmoil for U.S. foreign policy, which in turn invites two questions. The first one is, what are our foreign policy interests in that part of the world? In what ways is a national interest affected by what's happening in the Middle East? And the next question is, what steps should the administration, in this case the Obama administration, take, not only within the next few days, but within the next few months, to ensure that these foreign policy objectives and this national interest is protected? Let me start by asking, what are the major foreign policy goals and the needs that the United States experiences with regard to the Middle East? There are, I think, fourfold, and I'm mentioning them in approximate order of importance, which is according to them in Washington. I think the first one is that it is important to us to ensure that the Middle East not become a hotbed of transnational terrorism. We do not like terrorism with local implications, such as that practiced by Hamas, but we are particularly concerned about terrorism that can affect American lives and American interests. We're concerned with the kind of terrorism that Al-Qaeda represents. We don't want it to take root in the Middle East. The second thing that we're concerned with is the flow of oil. Our economy is very dependent on the continuing stream of oil flowing into it. This is not something that's likely to change in the near future. We still get a lot of our oil from the Persian Gulf region of the Middle East. Second goal, oil. Third goal, I think, is ensuring a Middle East peace, which is a concept that we have traditionally defined around the notion and need for ensuring Israel's security. Third goal. Fourth goal, promoting democracy and the kinds of political values which we think that we stand for. And let me ask how these four objectives are affected by what is happening in the Middle East. Terrorism, I don't think that there is likely to be any appreciable impact of the current turmoil in the Middle East on terrorism. People worry about Islamic organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood, but as we have heard, the Muslim Brotherhood is not Hamas. It is even less Al-Qaeda. The Muslim Brotherhood is essentially an organization which, for the moment, has renounced and repeatedly violent behavior, which has, in its 5 years in the Egyptian parliament, put this up by 20% of the seat, functioned pretty much as any other parliamentary political party. I certainly don't regard the Muslim Brotherhood as the source from which terrorism is likely to emerge. There are other organizations, such as the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which one might worry about a little bit more, but there is no conceivable concatenation of political circumstances in Egypt that would lead to a toleration by the regime of such organizations as the Islamic Jihad. If the turmoil in the Middle East were to lead to a total implosion of political authority in that part of the world, if the Middle East were to become Somalia writ large, yes, certainly it would become a hospitable environment for international terrorism. Nobody in the world believes that that is going to happen, and that will be one of the results of the current turmoil there. So I am not worried about terrorism resulting from this. Oil, look, Egypt is not a major producer of oil. It is like Yemen, an oil-poor country. Obviously, if the turmoil were to spread to Saudi Arabia and oil-rich Gulf nations, we might ask ourselves what the implications are. And the first question we would have to ask is, if democracy does spread to that part of the world, is that really going to hurt our oil interests? And if democracy does not, if authoritarianism and aging autocracies retain their grip on that part of the world, well, oil revenues are the lifeblood to their survival. They're not going to stop selling it to us. I see no particular risk as far as oil supplies are concerned. Third thing, Middle East peace and security of Israel, things become a little bit more complicated to the extent that any Egyptian government is likely to include members of the Muslim Brotherhood, maybe other people who are not quite as benignly inclined toward Israel as Hosni Mubarak was. Even Mohammed al-Baradei, for example, is firmly opposed to the blockade of Gaza. I think that we would have to expect a slightly harder line on Israel from any government that emerged in this part of the world. Secondly, it's also possible that a youth-driven movement is one that is somewhat likely to be more concerned with the values of nationalism than has been the Mubarak government, and possibly also inclined to be slightly harder on Israel than the Middle East. There is also the in the United States, there's also the possibility that an increased sense of vulnerability on Israel's part could strengthen the hand of hard right in Israel and make negotiations for peace even harder than they currently are. But to that, my feeling is the hard right is in power in Israel pretty much. And the alternative scenario is that an increased sense of vulnerability, an increased sense that the power balance is shifting against Israel, might produce a greater willingness to relent on some of the issues in which Israel has been unable to relent, namely the settlement policies and the settlements in East Jerusalem. The situation, in any case, with regard to the Middle East peace and Israel is slightly more complex. Fourth problem, democracy. Here's where things really get a little bit messy and complicated. Partly because many Americans feel that democracy is sometimes incompatible with itself. It is a set of procedures. It's also a set of values, and it embodies a conception of human dignity. And people like to point to the fact that a poll conducted by the Pew Research group last year in Egypt found that the vast majority of Egyptians were very, very much committed to democracy. Good news. Bad news, 82% of all Egyptians believe that women caught in adultery should be stoned to death. Bad news. Is this the kind of result of the kind of policy that democracy will produce? Not terribly likely, but it does raise in the minds of some people these possible incompatibilities that we might have to deal with. And this makes it essential, of course, that any movement for democracy should not only concern itself with the outward procedural forms of democracy, but also with the basic values of human dignity that democracy is supposed to embody. But one has to look at the consequences of democracy. And it's important to understand that Hamas did come to power in Gaza via an election, that Hezbollah has become the dominant political force in Lebanon through the democratic process. And sometimes somebody has to live with these results. But this is a messy question, the question of democracy there. What should the United States do? There's very little it can do, or not very much that it can do. I think that the United States has probably been instrumental in limiting the coerciveness of the regime's response to the demonstrators, but I doubt that our ability to shape Egypt's political future is terribly impressive. That political future definitely rests in the hands of the Egyptian people and in the decisions that they make. What leverage do we have? We have a little bit of direct leverage, mainly through the military, the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military, in any most conceivable future governments, would continue to play an important, if not dominant, role. The $1.3 billion in military aid that we have given the Egyptian armed forces in 2010 provides a continued source of leverage over the policy of the government, over which the military itself exerts a certain amount of influence. A little bit of influence there. On the other hand, I think that the influence of the military in Egypt might wane, and a democracy as it is waning in Turkey, for example. And there is also the fact that there are limitations to how much leverage you get through foreign aid or military aid. Look, we give a lot of military aid to Egypt. We give twice as much to Israel. And we've had absolutely we've been totally unsuccessful in leveraging this into a change of the current regime's settlement policies. So I don't think that we should overestimate the amount of leverage that we'll get. Second source of possible influence and authority we could have over that part of the world involves what political scientists call soft power. The power that comes from the moral authority that we are perceived to have and from the presumption that the suggestions we make are suggestions that are just and suggestions that are benign. And here I think our reputation hangs on a thread. And it's certainly the case that popular perceptions of the United States have improved with Obama's election and his Cairo speech in July of 2009. But it is also the case that I believe that those perceptions have slipped in the face of the reticence of the Obama administration to endorse a forceful transition away from Mubarak's rule. And our concerns, and some of my co-panelists might address them too, the Obama administration's concerns are, well, what if this leads to chaos, the transition process, and chaos leads to, again, further round to terrorism? What happens if Mubarak resigns today? According to the Egyptian constitution, elections have to be held in 60 days. That means that only those movements that have some organizational foundation and infrastructure likely to compete successfully. For the moment, the only organization other than the National Democratic Party that has that is the Muslim Brotherhood. So we worry about some of those results too. And again, we're making this up as we go along on a day-to-day basis. It's a fluid situation. There are no easy solutions. But in my opinion, total chaos is unlikely to descend on Egypt. The revolution and transition is unlikely to be violent. This is not a revolution that's led by Trotsky. It's not a revolution that's led by Fidel Castro. It's not a revolution that's led by Ayatollah Khomeini. It's spontaneously driven by people power. And it has the complexion of what we'll call the colored revolutions of the 1990s, the Orange Revolution, the Cedar Revolution, and I believe that that is what it is going to produce. An initially imperfect form of democracy in which I do not worry about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood at most represents 10% of the electorate. In Egypt, its success in 2005 was as much a rejection of the Mubarak government as an endorsement of the Brotherhood. It has behaved perfectly responsibly in its 5 years in parliamentary power. I know that we want to hedge our strategic interests in the Middle East and our foreign policy interests with our belief in democracy, but my feeling is that ultimately you have to be on the right side of history, and that history will judge us on our performance with regard to support for democracy in Egypt far more than it will judge us on how shrewdly we hedged our various bets in that part of the world. Thank you.
Good evening. It's good to see you all. Today I'm going to talk about trying to situate what's going on in Egypt and some past history in Egypt within some kind of basic international politics concepts and ideas to give it some larger context. So we begin with is Egypt's a pretty powerful country, and it's important to understand that. First off, it has a very large population. It has the largest population in the Arab world and the second largest in the entire continent of Africa. It also has a good size, we're losing our edge there. It also has a big economy. So its economy is bigger than that of Sweden, Chile, Greece, Israel. It's 27th in the world out of roughly 190 countries. So it's a pretty good sized economy as well. It has a very powerful military. There's a pretty good ranking where they take in a whole lot of different factors. It's ranked 17th, which is top 10, out of the 180 militaries out there. It's got the largest Arab army in the world, over 300,000 people in the Egyptian army. Not surprising because it's drawing from that really big population and has conscription. It gives a big percent of its gross national product to the military. The percent of GDP that goes into the military in Egypt is larger than that of France or South Korea or even Iran. And remember, it's a good-sized GDP, too. It's not like it's just a tiny, tiny GDP, and that's why they have to do that. It's also a very serious technology and arms producer. So they've been building fighter aircraft in Egypt since 1962. They built a co-license with the United States, the M1A1, which is the world's most advanced tank, some 60-plus tons. It has a jet turbine engine. It's an incredibly sophisticated tank. So it's very serious technology, very serious military hardware. So when you're looking at Egypt, it's a pretty powerful country in terms of its military, its population, its economy. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is Egypt's ability to project influence within the region or even globally is something that needs to be considered as well. And these give you some sense of why that might be the case, what's going on there. Starting in the 1970s, Egypt switched during the Cold War from being a Soviet ally to being an American ally. And that's a big part of the discussion that's going on here. So Professor Nincic was talking about the close ties between the United States and Egypt, and that wasn't always the case. For 20-plus years, the Soviet Union and Egypt had very close ties. The epitome of the closeness of these ties came out in the 1991 Gulf War, where Egypt fought alongside of the United States with thousands of troops against another Arab country. It's very important to remember that. Against another Arab country, Egypt's fighting alongside of the United States, the big ally of Israel. And so in terms of keeping in mind kind of the attitudes of Egypt and what's going on, it's important to remember they lost people in this war fighting as the United States ally. Obviously, one of the factors in the Arab world that distinguishes Egypt and a big part of regional and global concern about what's going on in Egypt is its relation with Israel, and that Egypt is the first Arab country to create peace with Israel. And that's a very, very big deal. It's a big deal. It has a lot of implications, both regionally and globally. It creates a status at the forefront of the vanguard of peace, a mantle of being a leader that needs to be taken into account. We'll talk about that in a second. So the peace agreement that came through with Egypt and Israel came out of Jimmy Carter's negotiations in the Camp David Accords. And Camp David Accords. And the Camp David Accords are actually two peace treaties, as Professor Biale talked about just briefly. So they're negotiated in 78, they're signed, ratified, go into force in 79. The key part is they normalize relations between Egypt and Israel. They made enormous land transfer from Israel to Egypt. And they formalized United States involvement with both countries. Because part of the way that this worked was the United States agreed to provide security, military bases, and billions of dollars of aid annually to both countries if they would cut this deal and formulate peace with each other and give up territory. So all three of these go down. Peace, exchange of territory, and locking in the U.S. commitment to these two countries. The second treaty, which Professor Biale referred to, was supposed to encourage autonomy of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, right? And that hasn't been implemented as fully. There's also, the Camp David Accords led to a dramatic increase in economic ties between Israel and Egypt. Egypt provides a very large percentage of the natural gas that Israel uses, and there's other exchanges that go back and forth. It ended the whole frame of Israel versus the Arab world, right? It cracked that, it shattered that frame, and as a result, there was movement in a lot of other countries, and the most obvious one is Jordan, and that clearly led to the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, which isn't quite as complete as that of Egypt and the Camp David Accords, but still all this kind of movement in the same direction, a peaceful direction. So one of the quotes that came out lately, which actually I was going to talk about something else that Professor Maoz had, and I saw this quote, and it so irritated me, I said I had to change the whole talk here. So all I've done in the last 2 days is worked on this talk because of this quote. And so people here, this is from a Likud party minister, and he says, people here will feel there's no point in a peace treaty if after 30 years it can be broken. So I want to put that into some context and try and explain why it's nonsense. Okay? So first off, I study peace treaties. Okay? Peace treaties are very fragile things. They're very hard to get. So the type of negotiations that President Carter initiated in 1978 that led to the Camp David Accords, they fail to lead to a treaty that lasts more than 2 months 75% of the time. Okay, usually they don't lead to a treaty, and if they do lead to a treaty, the treaty basically just fails instantly. So being able to survive 30 years, that's a really big deal. That isn't just like, 30 years, you know, that's the best we can. It's like, no, 30 years! And it hasn't failed yet. It's not like the treaty has failed or ended. It's really good for a treaty when you put it in context. Okay, let's put it in Israel context. What does the time before look like? Well, there's war in 48, 56. All right, that's what. So 30 years looks pretty good, right? A peace treaty. So I think that's just nonsense. All right. But what do the Camp David Accords tell us about Egypt? And we hear from the administration and from the panelists confusion. And part of the confusion is that it's clearly a moving target. The whole rebellion, what's going to happen? Is it going to be violent? Is it not going to be violent? Is Mubarak going to step down? Part of it is that. It's a moving target. It's hard to figure it out. But part of it I'm going to show you is that there's tension that the Camp David Accord clearly illustrates, which makes it unclear how we're going to move forward, because it's kind of like a tug of war being pulled in different directions. It's not clear which side is stronger. So to do that, we need to have a couple of concepts that we use in international politics. We're going to talk about selection effects and process effects. Selection effects identify a population's characteristics, something special about a population. Process effects tell you something about the direct effect. So let's give an example. Imagine that one of my students comes up to me and says, Professor, I got some bad news. I need to have open heart surgery. I say, oh my gosh, that's terrible. I'm really sorry to hear you need to have open heart surgery. You say, yeah, don't worry. I'm going to go over to the student health center and they're going to take care of it. And I said, you know, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Open heart surgery, it's a very, very serious business, you know, and I don't think you should be going to the student health center. I think you should go to the hospital. No, I looked it up. People die of open heart surgery at the hospital, but nobody dies of open heart surgery at the student health center. I'm going to be fine. Right? And so what the students failing to take into account are selection effects. The people who go to the health center are not especially sick. If they're really sick, where are they told to go? The hospital. And in fact, if the student comes back and says, okay, I have your advice, I went to the hospital, and they actually think I need to fly to the Mayo Clinic, what do you think about the student's health? Pretty bad, right? Why? Because the Mayo Clinic's really a terrible place? No, because it's like the best in the world, right? And so the better you are, the sicker people are going to be that come through that door. And so when at the Mayo Clinic, we know two things. Really sick people go there. It's in Rochester, Minnesota. It's really cold. No one's going to go there unless they're really, really sick, right? It's in Rochester, Minnesota. And you're going to get fantastic care. So you're going to see the beginning of that tug of war. Really good care, really sick people. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. Right? We don't know what the outcome is going to be. So let's see how that plays out with the Camp David Accords and some key ideas. So I was going to do this another way. Hold on. Let's get a volunteer real quick. How about you two guys? Can you come here? And can you help me as well? All right, so come down. If you guys can kind of just sit up here against the table, but don't bump it so we're not going to Professor Nincic. And if you could just stand over here. So I get the two guys over here. All right, and I want you to argue with each other.
Okay? All right, you gotta be...
Rabble.
All right. You whisper to that.
Rabble.
You guys arguing? Or...
Rabble.
Okay, so the first thing we notice is that power makes a difference, right? So when I speak very loudly, I'm able to influence them, and then when you kind of whispered, it was unclear. They had confusion about what they're supposed to do. So power makes a difference. So sure enough, when we look at, mediation, that powerful mediators make a difference. If you have a really powerful mediator, they can help people to stop fighting. At the same time, you only bring in the powerful mediator if they're like really sick. That is, if it's a really intractable dispute. So selection effects say tougher disputes. They have a really powerful mediator. That's going to say, this is like the really good doctor. It's going to be a tough dispute. Process effects going to be, hey, I can get them to stop better than she could because I had the microphone and I could be kind of louder. Okay. So now you guys go back to arguing.
Rabble.
All right. So imagine I say, okay, you're arguing. What I want you to do is just tell your feelings. Just explain your feelings. Okay, so we call that, in conflict management, we talk about the mediator can facilitate communications. Right? Or you can structure the process. You can say, no, hold on. You talk, you listen. No, you talk, you listen. Okay, so that's process. It's structuring the negotiation. Okay, or what you can say, look, if I give you a bump, you sit down, and then it's point. You don't get that. Okay, you sit down and you point. Yeah. All right, good. That's directive strategy. I'm influencing the outcome. All right, thank you guys very much. All right. So, as you use directive strategies versus process versus communication strategies, as you go up, that you're going to have that process effect. If you can manipulate outcomes, if you can put something on the table that make that outcome look sweeter, they're going to be less fighting. But at the same time, you don't want to spend the money without having to. So you only do that if it's a really bad dispute. So again, you got that tension both ways. So what does this mean for the Camp David Accords? Well, we see the United States, the most powerful country, the face of the planet, comes in, and the president puts his reputation on the line to negotiate. So that's really power. That's big power. It doesn't get more powerful. Okay, so that's like the really big doctor. That's like Baki or something. That's pretty serious business, right? So that's going to, one, be really helpful, but two, say, hey, this patient might be pretty ill. It's a pretty serious, intractable dispute. And then the United States, hey, we're going to give you each billions of dollars every year for like a long time. Again, that's obviously going to manipulate the outcome and make peace more attractive. But the U.S. only does that because you've got a really intense dispute. So what you get from the Camp David Accord is you see really clearly this tug of war. On one hand, the United States is going in and doing a lot to lead to a very robust outcome. And it's been 30 plus years. And we saw that in the context of things, 30 years is pretty good. On the other hand, it's a serious dispute. The United States wouldn't have done that, wouldn't have paid out all this cash, wouldn't have put its reputation on the line if it could have gotten off more cheaply. It only did that because it was such a tough dispute. So you see that tension that goes in. So when you look at all this, what the Camp David Accord suggests is, first off, 30 years is a long time. You've got to recognize that and appreciate that in terms of international context. Second off, part of this stability is a function of the mediation effort that the United States, President Jimmy Carter, and all presidents and administrations since have put into the region, and particularly into Israel and into Egypt. At the same time, you've got to recognize that by doing that, putting all that effort in, that's a sign that there's some deep underlying tensions that make it a difficult dispute, difficult peace to have. And so finally it suggests that the United States, in some form or another, although I agree it's difficult to know what that form is going to be critical to the post-Mubarak regime in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to speak from here. So, My job is to talk about the regional and global implications of the events in the Middle East. Let me start by pointing out that political revolutions in general are in many ways like volcano eruptions. In one sense, we know the trouble spots, but we can't predict with the best tools at our disposal when an eruption will take place. The second aspect that makes revolutions similar to volcano eruptions is just like volcano eruptions, pressure builds up for a very long time and it's invisible. And it takes one small crack in the path for the volcano to erupt. However, unlike volcano eruptions, in some cases political revolutions spread. And this has happened to a large extent in Europe in 1989. And regardless of how you view it, it's what's going on in the Middle East at present. We're not talking only about the changing government in Tunisia as a result of a popular uprising. We're not only talking about the event that we're following very intensely in Egypt. We're talking about potential changes and preemptions of regimes in Jordan, Yemen, to a lesser extent Syria, and perhaps Iran. What we've seen here is the crack and the eruption. The causes underlying these revolutions are deep and fundamental, and they entail economic problems. It's true that Egypt has a large economy, but its per capita GDP is about $6,000 and per capita income is about $2,000, as opposed to a per capita GDP of over $45,000 in the United States. So you can get a sense of what's going on. Egypt reports about 9.4% unemployment to the IMF. The truth of the matter is that unemployment rates in Egypt are double or triple that number, in fact, and they're very high among young. We're talking about a sense of lack of opportunity, lack of access to basic food commodities, rising food prices, declining job opportunities. All these things have been built for a very long time, and as Professor Watenpaugh pointed out, for over 30 years, the Egyptians have been living under an emergency law that prevented freedom of association, freedom of speech, although the Egyptians were never afraid to speak freely, and ridicule Mubarak and so on for a very long time. There's another thing that we have to keep in mind when we look at the regional and global implications of the events in the Middle East. And that is that many revolutions start with the aim of establishing or deposing of oppressive regimes and establishing democracy. But many revolutions are also hijacked by forces that end up in regimes that are in some cases worse than those that they sought to overthrow. We start with the French Revolution. It ended in a reign of terror and led to the Napoleonic dictatorship. And France of 1789 went through a series of wars since 1792 to 1815, which led to the killing of millions of French people. The Russian Revolution started out with a quest of democracy and ended up in a 70-year totalitarian regime. The Iranian Revolution started out as a democratic revolution in a coalition, a broad coalition, in which Islamists were only one element. But the revolution was hijacked by the Islamists. Now, that's not true for all revolutions. It's not true for most revolutions, but it's true for some. And This is one of the reasons that many people in the United States, in the Western world, are concerned about what's going on in Egypt. So I want to focus very briefly on 4 questions. First one is how far and how wide are these uprisings likely to spread? Second, how would the dramatic changes in the political makeup of some or most Arab states affect relations between or among Arab states? Third, how would these changes affect relations between the Arab world and the Western world? And finally, how would they affect the politics and economics of the region? So let me start out by prefacing my comment by saying that prediction is a very risky business, especially when we're dealing with events in the Middle East. But nevertheless, it's important to sort of assess some scenarios that might evolve out of what's going on at present in the Middle East. Well, let me say that everybody in the Middle East, as far as they have access to media, to all kinds of communication, are watching very closely what's going on in Egypt. Some, and it's applied both to governments and to oppositions, all kinds of oppositions in other Arab countries. Some governments have already taken some preemptive measures to try to deal with potential uprising. So Jordan, King Abdullah of Jordan, dismissed his cabinet and replaced it, and started a series of talks, very much like what's going on in Egypt, with the opposition, including the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. President Assad of Syria announced that he's beginning a series of reforms, although nobody knows what these reforms might be. We're not sure. I've been trying to follow what Saudi Arabia is doing. I've been trying to follow what the Gulf states are doing. I didn't see much evidence of any major activity in these countries, either on the side of opposition or on the side of the government there. But I'm pretty sure that they are looking at what's going on in Egypt because they feel like I said before, that things in the Middle East will never be the same after the collapse of the the Mubarak regime in Egypt. Now, the problem in other states is that they're very different in many ways from Egypt. And the reaction to uprising in other countries in the Middle East might also be fundamentally different. Egypt is a very homogeneous society in terms of ethnicity. It does have a large ethnic Coptic minority, but this minority is well co-opted into the Egyptian society. There were some terrorist events against the Coptic society, but the Copts are taking part in the uprising and are actually guarding the Muslims when the Muslims are praying, and the Muslims are trying to guard the Copts when the Copts are praying. Syria is a different story. In Syria, we have a minority of an Alawite ethnic group, which accounts for roughly 16 or 17% of the Syrian population, but runs almost all of Syria. And they have a long blood feud with the Sunnis have a long blood feud with the Alawite regime. Assad's father massacred over 20,000 Sunnis in Hama in 1982. So there's a lot of tension going on. It's unlikely that the Syrian military would assume a position of neutrality if a uprising emerges in Syria. Jordan is also a complicated story. 60% Palestinians, 40% government-run Bedouin and assorted people, many of which came into Jordan from Saudi Arabia. Again, Palestinians have been co-opted to a large extent into Jordanian society, but nobody knows what's going to happen if an uprising emerges in Jordan as well. So the question that comes to mind is, if these changes spread, to what extent will these changes result in the widespread democratization of Arab states in the Middle East, like Europe of 1989, like Eastern Europe of 1989, or will some or all of these revolutions be hijacked? And if they're hijacked, who will do the hijacking? One possibility is that the military would do some of the hijacking and they'll replace one dictator with another. Another possibility might be that the Islamic organization, which may not have the popular support, but have the organization and control pivotal aspect of society through the mosque, can basically take over the revolution. So that's the regional concern. What happens in terms of relations between Arab states? Malcolm Kerr, a UCLA professor and president of the Beirut University, of the American University in Beirut, who was assassinated in 1984, wrote a book called The Arab Cold War. And he characterized the relations in the Middle East between or among Arab states in the 50s and 60s as a Cold War, which in a sense was a political struggle or political competition between radical pan-Arab regimes led by Nasser and the conservative monarchies such as Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Again, the Middle East has, to a large extent, been pacified in terms of inter-Arab relations. There was still competition. Egypt was and still is considered to be the leader of the Arab world, and what happens in Egypt will affect relations among other Arab societies. But if the Middle East is polarized again between democracies and authoritarian regime, we might see a resumption of some sort of Cold War. Another troubled spot in the region is Lebanon. Lebanon, the government of Saad Hariri was replaced by a coalition supported by Hezbollah. Everybody is waiting to see to hear the outcomes of the tribunal, the international tribunal that was appointed to investigate the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in 2005. The expectation is that if the tribunal publishes its finding, it will put blame on Hezbollah for this murder. If that happens, we're likely to see some increased conflict in Lebanon, perhaps a return to civil war. Everybody is concerned about that because Lebanon has been doing spectacularly well over the last few years, especially economically. So there's a concern that we're going to go back to chaos in the Middle East. What happens in terms of the relations between the Arab states and the world? Well, Professor Nincic hinted a little bit to the attitude of the West to democracy in the Arab world. And it sort of reminds me of a story of a couple that gets dressed to go to the opera, and the husband is putting on his jacket, a picture falls out, and the wife picks up the picture, and there's a picture of a beautiful young girl. And she asks the husband, "Who is this woman?" And the husband says, "I can't lie to you, this is my mistress." So the woman composes herself and says, "We'll talk after the opera." And they go to the opera and sit, and 2 rows in front, there is Mr. Johnson, the neighbor, sitting with a young blonde girl. And the wife asks her husband, "Who is that woman? It's not Mr. Johnson's wife." And he says, "Oh, this is Mr. Johnson's mistress." So the woman pulls out the picture from her purse and looks at it and looks at the other woman and says, "Our mistress is nicer." So that's sort of the attitude of the West to democracy or to dictatorship. I mean, we hate dictators, but our dictators are nicer. So the question is, how would, in general, the attitude of the West in general, and Israel in particular, to democratization in the Arab world is extremely suspicious for the reason that I mentioned, the fear that revolution would be hijacked by extremists. However, and this is what I want to conclude with. There are two things that we know about international politics that we're sort of, one thing that we're fairly sure about, and one thing we're debating. And these two results basically offer both hope and concern. The first result that we have, that some people call as close as to a law of international relations as we have, is what the so-called democratic peace. The finding that since the early 19th century, democracies have almost never fought each other in a full-scale war and have rarely clashed with one another in low-level conflict. This result is very robust. People have tested and retested it over and over again and came up with the same finding. There are many and complex reasons for the democratic peace. I'm not going to go into that. But if democracy spreads to the Middle East, if true democracy spreads to the Middle East, democratic peace suggests that we will have more rather than less international stability in the region, as happened in other regions of the world that have democratized. The second finding, which is still a source of debate in international relationship, is about the effects of democratization processes. People who have studied transformation from authoritarian to democratic regime found that the process of democratization tends to be very violent. So once you have two stable democracies, the likelihood of war between them approaches zero. However, the process of transition is very dangerous. Again, there are multiple and complex reasons for that. But if the transition to democracy is difficult, has to go through a lot of obstacles, making, externalizing or creating some sort of diversionary outside regimes have done that in the past as they try to transform into a democracy. And ultimately, not only did war ensue, but many of the regimes reversed back to authoritarian regimes. So we're basically in a state of crisis, which in the Chinese version of the term creates both risks and opportunities. Where we go from here depends very much on the outcome of the process that started in Tunisia, is evolving in front of our eyes in Egypt, and might spread to other parts of the Middle East. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions. There are two microphones on both sides of the aisle. So those of you who would like to ask questions, please approach the microphone. And please make your questions brief and one question per person.
With the controversy going on now, do you see more likelihood that the Arab countries will actually help facilitate a two-state, Israel and a Palestine state? From everything I've seen in the past, they've stood firmly against it, using Israel as the common denominator to kind of persuade their constituents to look someplace else rather than internal.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that certainly it has been the case often in the Middle East that regimes deflect public opinion towards Israel instead of to what's going on in their own countries. My guess is that if Egypt does democratize, and it will be this sort of difficult process without a doubt, they're going to be very preoccupied with what's going on at home. They have to revolutionize the whole society, which is dominated by the military. There's this kind of crony capitalism there, in which wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very small kind of kleptocracy, as it's called. So, I suspect that people won't really have an appetite for opening up a front against Israel. I do think that because public opinion will be so strong, as I said in my remarks, that public opinion will be so strongly in favor of, a solution there, whereas Mubarak, was able to sort of buffer the thing and not really, he was active, but he clearly didn't really achieve very much. There's a possibility that it could break things loose.
Let me just point out that there is a resolution of the Arab League that was first voted upon in 2002 and then was reiterated in 2007. We call it the Saudi Initiative. And this resolution is a general resolution. It was accomplished by consensus, including support by such regimes as Syria, that essentially accepts a two-state solution under certain conditions, and is willing in exchange for a two-state solution, in exchange of Israel's acceptance of these conditions within a context of a two-state solution, to grant Israel with full-fledged peace, full diplomatic and economic relations, and so on. Now, everything is possible, but changing this kind of resolution, I think, would be very difficult. And currently, all Arab states or members of the Arab League are bound by this resolution. Yes, sir.
Given how pragmatic Americans are generally and their stake in politics, which I personally feel extends to the question of how does this affect me, for the people in this room that doesn't necessarily resonate, but for the average American who just wants to know what this is going to do for them tomorrow, what would you say to that person? How does that affect them? How does this...
Raise gas prices.
In the short term, and in terms of what matters most to Americans, which is, I guess, terrorism and oil, I don't think it's going to affect them one way or another. I think that the impact from the United States is one of democratization in the Middle East and on the transitional pains of this democratization experiences. These are effects that will be felt one generation from now, possibly, and not in the short term. In the short term, I don't think that you or your neighbor or your butcher baker or candlestick maker will have their lives changed one way or another.
I'm going to disagree slightly. And this is also, like historians mixed with political scientists, because we'll look at these things in a different way. I think Americans have a great deal at stake in the outcome of what happens in Egypt. Not just in terms of sort of regional politics, not in terms of... But we've just fought, or been forced to fight, 2 wars about radicalism, about Islamism, and about issues and states and governments which take shape in the absence of democracy. And the best inoculation, as far as I'm concerned, against the persistence of Islamist radicalism, against the creation of the kinds of far right-wing, quasi-fascist regimes like those that existed in Iraq, the best inoculation against that is a process of sometimes violent, sometimes difficult, but real democratization. That ultimately, America's not just long-term, but even short-term interests in avoiding future wars and not having to fight these sorts of wars against terrorism are really served by a process of opening up, of supporting transparent good governments, of supporting democracies around the world. And so, I was looking at a Pew survey before I came, but even though most Americans have no idea what's going on in Egypt, most Americans are really in favor of what's happening there. So, because the thing is that what the people on the street of Egypt are asking for are some very basic things that we often take for granted. And I know that doesn't, in sort of the grand world of democratic theory and so on, these things don't, there's no variable for it, as Scott would say. But that this is something which now binds us to the Egyptians in a very profound way. And that we are at a moment of where we need to reset our relationship with the entire Arab world, and we should use this moment to our advantage. So to answer your question, yes, gas prices will go up. But we're at a moment where if we play this right, we may not have to fight these stupid wars again.
Yes, good question about comment and followed by a question. You know, both the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolutions have one thing in common, or showed something in common, and that is both countries didn't have an alternative for those leaders. So those regimes were very successful in making sure no viable leadership was able to take over if they were pushed out of power. So do you think it would be smart of the U.S. or of the Western democracies to invest in bringing out these future leaders, the democratic, maybe helpful leaders from the point of view of our interests, and giving them the limelight soon enough so they can get elected, or at least have a chance of getting elected in an upcoming election?
I mean, there's two very important points that you make in this. One is that the strategy adopted, and always remember, the Egyptian leadership that's in power now has been in power for a very long time, and they know how to run things. And one of the things they really understand how to run is to figure out who might be a real challenge to them. They either co-opt them, or they imprison them, or they exile them, or they kill them. So, I mean, your point is true, that they have been very successful in preventing opposition to arise. So that's one issue. But I think that we in the West right now are underestimating that possibility. I think there are people there who can move into positions of leadership. They may have to even be, I mean, I hate to say it, it's like if you think about it in our experience with Eastern Europe, often people who had to help run Eastern European societies during the process of democratization were middle-ranking communists. So in fact, we may have to look for good leadership in Egypt from the middle ranks of the National Democratic Party or something, right? The other point is, should the United States go around helping identify future leaders of Egypt? I think it's probably the worst thing we can do for them, personally, because, it's very easy. I mean, I know in Baradei, the fellow, I mean, he's easily painted as a tool of the West or a tool of Iran because of his very well-known is a very well-known persona within the West, and sort of labeling or sort of appending some kind of Western gold star to him at this moment would really be more like putting a target on his back.
I'm interested in the panels.
I just wanted to add two things to that. Another thing they have in common is neither have a lot of oil reserves, and so what President Watenpaugh is talking about is exactly correct, but you can buy off people a lot better if you got a lot more cash, right? And so the oil regimes have been much more effective at doing that. And that's one of the reasons that this hasn't spread as much to them. It's been and it hasn't also been at the poorest countries. So it's like Tunisia is actually quite a bit wealthier than Morocco, and Egypt, in terms of Africa, is actually one of the wealthier countries. In terms of the Middle East, on a per capita basis, it's much less wealthy than a lot of the Arab states, but it's that kind of lower middle class where people have just enough to feel they don't have as much as they should have, versus the subsistence living where they can't think about protesting or tomorrow because they got to work today or they're not eating tonight. So you have to have at least a little bit of economy going for you, but not so much like the Arabs, the oil states where they can just buy off any of the leadership. And then the second thing is that the U.S. has, while we haven't identified a Václav Havel and anointed them and brought them in, the United States essentially has done that in a serendipitous, in a much more low-key way with this rebellion. I mean, one of the reasons that it's a rebellion, not a revolution. You don't know, is this Tiananmen Square where people were in the streets and it looks like it's a done deal and oops, wrong. It's the status quo, or is it Czechoslovakia, right? We don't know. You got to keep that in mind. It's not clear where this is going. And so, but what the United States has done, which is making a big difference from Tiananmen Square, is that many of the leaders in the Egyptian military have been educated in the United States. And one of the reasons that people are not being systematically slaughtered by this this organization whose function is to establish violence and be very, very good at it, is because of that U.S. influence. So the U.S. is having an influence on the leadership. It's providing voice to these people by encouraging a professionalization among the Egyptian military, which is giving them that space to issue that voice.
Well, I hope it's that good. Panel's opinion on U.S. intervention, given the classification of our interests, which is stability in the region, with, I think, the status quo between Israel and the Arab countries, and our interest in oil. It seems to me these predominate over our interest in democracy. And I'm really afraid the U.S. will intervene on the side of autocracy, because that's cheaper for us, that's easier for us. We have removed democratically elected leaders, most famously in Iran. So where do you think the U.S. will intervene outright, and whose side, the people or the Mubarak government?
If by intervene you mean intervene militarily?
Well, anyway, manipulate. How's that?
Well, it certainly has been doing that for a long time. It's not just manipulating the politics of the Middle East in order to preserve aging autocracies is something that's going to emerge around the corner that we've never seen before. It's certainly been very much part of the history of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. If by intervene you mean doing something radical that hasn't been done before to preserve these autocracies, no, I don't think that is the case. If we take this to the extreme and say, would we commit American boots on the ground to this part of the world to preserve autocracy, I'd say the probability is approximately zero here. The support for military intervention, given our experiences in Iraq, ultimately, and experiences that very badly with most Americans, the likelihood of a prolonged, painful, and frustrating involvement and entanglement in Afghanistan, I think that all of these things preclude popular support for anything approaching the use of American armed force and foreign soil in this part of the world.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for the questioner's concern here, if we just look back over the last week, the way the Obama administration's flip-flopped, which is not very impressive, frankly. That the first they said we want change now, we want Mubarak out now. Now means now, and then 2 days later, well, we're going to support Suleiman. It's a gradual transition until September, and so I think that does certainly arouse a kind of a sense of unease, to say the least, about whether we actually know what we're doing.
Oh, and I quite agree with that, but that's the answer to a different question, perhaps. Has the Obama administration shown great profiles of courage or determination with regard to the developments in the Middle East? I'd have to say, talking to the eyes of the demonstrators in Egypt, almost certainly not.
Media coverage of the protests in Egypt has focused mostly on the events in Tahrir Square and to a limited extent what's been going on in Alexandria and Suez. And I'm just wondering to what extent you know about people's opinions outside of Tahrir Square, and will that ultimately affect the outcome of the revolution?
Well, there's labor unrest in Tanta and Damietta. There were demonstrations in Luxor and Asyut in Upper Egypt. This seems to be where there's university towns, Zagazig and so on. Anywhere there's a major university, there's been demonstrations. So it's even though so much of the energy for the demonstrations, and I really think it is a revolution, is really coming from the urban middle class of Cairo. I mean, Cairo's a giant city, right? So it's not insignificant, but this is really interesting things and important things are happening all over the country. What's interesting is we're not getting good coverage of what's happening in the northern Sinai, where there seems to have been a great deal more violence and attacks on important infrastructure and so on.
I think that an important point about the effect of the uprising is that really revolutions are made by small minorities. That happened, in all major transformation of political and social systems anywhere in the world. You have an activist mass that basically goes out, demonstrates, engages in some cases in violence, and brings about the overthrow of the regime. In many cases, most of the people sit on the sidelines and watch what's going to happen and try to avoid the violence. But those who are committed are those that drive change. And these tend to be minority, and Professor Watenpaugh is right. What we've seen here is a revolution of the young, the middle classes, the educated, and people are saying, I've attended a teaching just before this panel, and they were saying that you have a lot of peasants and a lot of ordinary, low-class people participating, but the driving force of the organizers come from the middle class, the educated. And that's where the most of the dissatisfaction and frustration emerges.
I add two things. One is that with Egypt, you have a very urban country, right? So Alexandria and Cairo and the Nile Valley is going to capture a really big percentage of the population. Two is I've done a research on the media, and so the media is basically interested in two stories. One is what they see as kind of the big picture, and that's clearly the square in Cairo. I mean, that's the big, that's the key story, right? Everything else is hanging off of that. And two, they care about local stories. And so you're seeing the interview with the person who's stuck in the hotel room in Luxor. It's not that Luxor is special. They're not showing you the cool pictures of what's around Luxor and the relics and all that. They're showing you a still shot, and you're hearing this bad cell phone voice. Yes, the room service is terrible, right? I mean, it's just, things like that. Because it's this local story, and then they show her, her house in Westchester or something like that. So those are the two stories that you're going to hear. You're going to hear the square, because that's the big story. It's not the full story, you're right, but it's the big story. And then you're going to hear these really ad hoc local stories, because that feeds the media market, what they're interested in doing. So you got to keep in mind that their interests are different from your interests in terms of conveying the story. It's not that I'm not saying they're malicious, but they just have a different set of interests in putting a story together that they think is going to be interesting to their audience.
Taking into account like American previous intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then seeing the revolution happening now, is that concrete proof that, according to George Bush's administration, bringing democracy through U.S. intervention is ultimately futile, and that it has to come within, and moreover,